Okay, so that is it for me. And it is my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Mark Stouts, the previous director of the Historical Society. So, big round of applause for Mark. And I'm going to let it Mark facilitate everything, but just a huge thanks to our research staff, Alexandra and Megumi, and our volunteers, Gary and Dan. Also, Gary, a board member for the Historical Society as well. So thank you for all your research and for all the months that led into not led his presentation today, but the wonderful exhibits that you can see to your right and behind you today. So thank you again for being here, our parents. Thank you so much for your time today. Omar, please take it away.
Hey, thanks. Right. You guys hear me okay? Yeah. Uh, okay. So, a lot of what we do at the Historical Society is research. Um, you all know about the lectures, you know about our museums. A lot of what we do is research at our archives and research facility at the Miller Branch Library. And I had been wanting, when I was director, to do something about the Underground Railroad in Howard County. There was a lot of, I guess, misinformation about it, and so we wanted to take a different approach and present some things that we knew were accurate, that we knew were true, based on our research and extensive research. Actually, we spent several months working on this particular exhibit. So today we're going to talk about the research process a bit, and we're going to talk about some of the stories that we uncovered in the process of doing the research. I'm going to let my colleagues introduce themselves as well. Just keep in mind, Alexandra Sedor cannot be here today, but she was really, really instrumental in a lot of this research. She did a lot of hard work on this, and I just want to make sure we acknowledge that. Megumi?
Hi, I'm Megumi. I'm the research assistant, and I mainly helped with putting together a lot of the documents for the other researchers who were looking into the stories. So, pulling those from the archives and things like that. So,
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm a volunteer researcher and been working on various projects over the years. And the research requests that come in, which are very varying in topic and sometimes the lengths. But anyway, Jerry?
Hi, I'm Jerry Uekermann. I was a volunteer on this project, and I did a fair amount of research at the Maryland Archives in Annapolis and some research on the Washington, D.C. Underground Railroad since they're south of Howard County and some of the freedom seekers who they helped came through Howard County.
Okay, so I do a lot of presentations to local groups, to schools, to teachers, 55 plus centers. I got to know all the 55 plus centers in Howard County, by the way. There's some really wonderful facilities out there. But in any event, I always start with this slide because a lot of people don't realize this part of Howard County's history, which is that we were a slave county and a slave state. And enslaved men and women worked the fields here. This was a plantation-based economy, originally based on tobacco. And it's just important to acknowledge that this was the South. We were below the Mason-Dixon line and an occupied state during the Civil War. And Howard County was right in the middle of that culture, if you will. Jerry, I thought do you want to do this?
Oh, yeah. So the initial observations, we didn't find evidence of a well-organized network of abolitionists in Howard County. The enslaved people from Howard County who escaped to the north mostly did so through their own efforts with the advice of local people, usually free blacks, who acted independently, we believe, of any organized network of abolitionists. The next point was the south of Mason-Dixon line activities.
Should have on this state.
Oh, sure. Good carrier. So south of the Mason-Dixon line, the activities of the Underground Railroad were more limited than in the north. And there were orders of magnitude the difference between how people who assisted enslaved people who were trying to escape were treated in the North and how they were treated in Maryland. Most of the people who escaped from Howard County would have gone to York County and Adams County in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, before 1850, someone who assisted freedom seekers wasn't threatened really with the possibility of any jail time. After the Federal Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, which applied across the whole country, people who helped freedom seekers were could be potentially incarcerated for 6 months. And that also applied in Pennsylvania. But I can't find any record where anybody in Pennsylvania was ever charged for actually assisting fugitives in Pennsylvania. So the danger to people in Pennsylvania of any kind of like a criminal prosecution was very small. If you contrast that to Maryland, in Maryland in 1850, somebody who assisted the slave to escape got a minimum of 6 years in a state prison and could be as much as 15 years. So the penalties there were 12 to 30 times greater than the incarceration sentence under federal law. And dozens of people were convicted in Maryland, some from Howard County. So the danger in Maryland is very, very real. I mentioned before the Underground Railroad in Washington, D.C., and the southernmost outpost of the Underground Railroad was in Washington, D.C., and it began operating there in the early 1840s. And there's a couple of pieces of evidence, one involving the operations of the Washington Underground Railroad in 1842 and 43, and another piece of evidence involving the Underground Railroad in Washington in 1850 that suggests that the Underground Railroad didn't have stations or safe houses in Howard County. But there's another piece of evidence that comes from a secondhand account that was first published in 1868. So it's an old account, but it was a secondhand account of an escape from Washington, D.C. that occurred in 1842. And that account says that the Washington Underground Railroad had an agent maintaining station 6 miles from Baltimore that was next to the Washington branch of the B&O Railroad. So the Washington branch of the B&O Railroad runs between Baltimore and Washington, and it is, for the most part, the eastern boundary of Howard County, although in the north, in the Ellicott City area, it's entirely within Howard County. Anyway, this could have been near Elkridge, where this station was, and the Underground Railroad agent who maintained the station was a free black man named Ben, who rented some land next to the railroad. He grew some corn on it and had some little huts that he covered with corn stalks to camouflage them, that housed those who were escaping slavery on their way to Baltimore. So it's possible that that's in Howard County, but that's, depends a lot on how accurate that account is. And I would note that there's other parts of that same account that don't match up with some other information that we have. So, and there's also some records indicating that the Washington Underground Railroad helped enslaved people along Charles Carroll and John McTavish escape in 1842. But most enslaved people in Howard County probably escaped through their own efforts with the advice of trusted Howard County residents who acted independently and not as part of a larger network. And we found 2 men who can fairly be described as conductors, men who guided freedom seekers to Pennsylvania. Talk about them later. So most of the escape routes would have been from south to north. The most common routes we found were the Washington branch of the B&O Railroad, the Washington Turnpike, which is Route 1, And probably most used appears to be the Route 97, Georgia Avenue and Westminster Road that ran from D.C. to Westminster into Pennsylvania. Um, and most enslaved people did have very little knowledge of geography beyond where they lived, so they had to get help from others, usually before they attempted to escape in order to have a reasonable chance of being successful. And this map shows the Westminster Pike route that's taken through the western part of Howard County, and then the Washington Turnpike and the Washington branch of the D&R Railroad that's through the eastern part of the town.
Because the Underground Railroad and individual cases of people assisting freedom seekers were clandestine operations, the documented cases are not representative of all instances of people helping enslaved people. And the research using the documents can be really difficult for this topic due to the limited information that has been preserved. Additionally, most enslaved people were illiterate, so they were unable to preserve their stories through physically documented forms. In our research, we used court documents involving those who were charged with helping or persuading freedom seekers, and these court documents from our collections ranged from 1834, which is the earliest that we have, to 1864. And freedom seeking often required the assistance of others, and most people charged with helping freedom seekers were free blacks in the Howard District in Anne Arundel County, which later became Howard County in 1851. There were also people who were encouraging others to seek freedom, and they were charged with distributing anti-slavery publications and inciting insurrection if they were caught. Here's a timeline of the documented cases that our team found during our research, and particularly through our collection of court documents that we have. The court documents only really tell us about who was really involved in the freedom seeking, in assisting the freedom seekers, but they don't tell the deeper stories of who they were or where they lived, especially in relation to the people they were helping. We also collaborated with a variety of people in order to gain better perspectives of how to interpret and understand the court documents, which was really helpful throughout our process. And then, so using these census records, runaway advertisements in newspapers, newspaper articles, account books, and maps, not only was our team able to understand how we could corroborate the information that we found in the documents, but we were also able to provide a deeper story and picture of the people we'll be highlighting today.
So, actually successfully escaping from slavery in Maryland was a very daunting task. In Maryland, all black people were presumed to be slaves, and if they were stopped, they had to produce a certificate of freedom to show that they were free, or a pass from their master. If they couldn't produce these things, they could be incarcerated as a suspected runaway. The slave owners typically offered rewards, often large rewards, $200-$300 sometimes, which is in the ballpark for what a lot of people earn in a year. And so they offered these significant rewards for the capture of enslaved people who had escaped. And that then incentivized a vast part of the public to try to stop white people who they encountered who they didn't recognize as locals. And then you also had the slave catchers who used dogs to track down people who had escaped, and they sometimes did these slave catchers as a like kind of to supplement their income. So with all of these dangers, the people who were escaping had to follow some rules that would allow them to successfully escape. For example, they typically traveled by night and hid during the day. They often avoided walking on roads, even at night, where they might be seen. They often escaped on weekends or holidays when they would have they had Sundays off. So if they escaped on a Saturday night, it might not be till Monday that they were noticed to be gone. And then the newspapers also didn't publish every day necessarily, so there was a delay time between when an escape occurred and a reward notice went into a newspaper. And to avoid towns, even at night, you have a dog barking or something like that that could alert people to their presence and then to be discovered. Sometimes they took food, or they were provided by food by people who they encountered, but mostly they were very wary of trusting people who they encountered because they didn't know if they would try to turn them in or not. And most important, before you attempted to escape, it was important to do preparation with, which consisted probably in Howard County mostly of talking to people who could give them directions for roads to follow, maybe draw out a map, something like that, and also give them the advice of you travel by night and the other advice that I've already discussed. So there was like groundwork that had to go into it, and there were decisions to be made about who to go with, whether to go alone or with a group. And some people have noted that there are dangers in going to large groups because that increased the risk that somebody might say something and they'd be discovered, or if a plan to escape will be discovered. And then they had to say to revise to people, their family and friends, because if they successfully escaped, and they wouldn't be back. And if they were captured, there's a good chance that they would be sold to the South afterwards. So this was really a make or break thing.
So, in this particular area in Ellicott City, there's no evidence that the Quakers here were deeply involved in the abolitionist movement. More so in the Sandy Spring area, if you're familiar with that, part of Montgomery County, where there was a much larger Quaker contingent. In fact, some of the progeny of the original three Ellicott brothers were actually enslavers. George Ellicott III, who we'll talk about a little bit later, was an enslaver, for example. So even though they weren't really involved in the abolitionist movement, they did provide opportunities to free blacks. Education, they sold land, and employed free blacks in their factories along the river. So even though the Quakers weren't directly involved, they in some way facilitated the large free black population, primarily in the Ellicott Mills area. So the local free black community was called Missionary Bottom, and it's right here, down the street from here. That area of Ellicott City on Merriman Street. And it featured a black church and a black and mulatto property owners, including Levi Gillis, who many believe built the log cabin that's on Main Street today, and was on his land. And you can still go there today. There are just a bunch of really nice houses up there now, but that is where the black community originated here in this area. And we believe there's some evidence that a few of the names that you'll see up there on the timeline actually lived in this area. And there it is today, thanks to Google Earth. You can drive up Merriman Street. It turns into Hill Street on the other side, but that corner up there where it starts to turn was the Missionary Bottom area.
Can you point answers?
You can't really see it. It's not there anymore. The church is now on Main Street. You'll see it on the left-hand side, the black church that's there.
Where's Wayne Street? What are we looking at?
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can do.
It's not big, so big as it.
No, that's not big. So what you're looking at, if you can see, there's Merriman Street comes up. If you look, you can see the little that little kind of red dot there. That's Merriman Street. If you follow that up, it turns into High Street on the other side, which you can see comes down on Main Street. It's kind of like a U. But anyway, that's the original area, and you can walk up there today and see it, or take a drive.
More.
Yeah.
What is at the upper right of the picture? What is that large peg? Yellow looks like a road, or
That's the Accepted Preserve. That's HB's. That's
Yeah, that's Main Street.
at the big parking road.
Yeah. Yeah, just to orient yourself. Yeah. There's the big parking lot down there on the right. Actually, you can see the back of Merriman Street from that parking lot. The lower lot. The big lot where they have concerts and stuff. So, let's talk about Harriet Tubman. So for many years, there were stories that Harriet Tubman helped enslave people here in Howard County escape to the north. There's no historical evidence to support that. In fact, I actually reached out to her biographer, Kay Larson, and Dr. Larson indicated that no, that's not really possible. She was never in Howard County. All of the people that she helped escape were from one place, Dorchester County on the Eastern Shore. And most of those people were her family members. So this is not to in any way, she was the most famous of all our Underground Railroad conductors, but there's no evidence that she was here. So how did these stories begin? How did this happen? How did this kind of folklore about Harriet Tubman begin? So Dr. Stuart Fraser, who is a professor at HCC, wrote a piece actually for The Legacy a number of years ago. He proposed that the local Black community really wanted to connect to this most famous of all conductors in a way to kind of elevate their history and background. So that was his theory. There's a local author, Wayne Davis, who some of you know, and Wayne pointed out that the area associated with those Tubman stories is Simpsonville. Simpsonville is today actually. You'll hear more about Simpsonville from Lee Preston a little later, but that area of the county is part of the Patuxent River watershed. Patuxent River runs to the southeast, so it is not a natural location for escape. In fact, Wayne pointed out there really are no natural escape routes. The only route near there was the Columbia Turnpike, Route 29, which led directly to Ellicott City. So there really was no natural place for slaves to escape. And that's the place where you'll see a lot of the material. In fact, it was even on the county website until very recently that this was actually true. So I actually worked with our tourism group and welcome center and said, that's inaccurate. You really need to take that down. So there's another version of the story that focuses on a place called Deep Run. Deep Run is a tributary of the Patapsco River. It is in the Mayfield area of the county, and it runs all the way to Elbridge and beyond, and flows into the Patapsco a bit to the east of Elbridge. So here's a story that I distinctly remember. When I was working in the school system, we did something for the Howard County Sesquicentennial. And one of the things we did was interview local people. And I interviewed a gentleman named Dr. Roland Howard, or Reverend Roland Howard, who grew up next to Deep Run. And Reverend Howard told me, I want to show you a place. And he took me down to Deep Run, and he showed me a series of rocky outcroppings and caves. And he said, this is where she hid the slaves that were escaping in these caves. So I was like, oh, okay. Well, I said, what evidence is there that was her, And he said, well, right on the other side was an enslaver named Theodore Tubman. You can't read it there, but Theodore Tubman owned all of this property along Deep Run. So they used that as the justification. And but Theodore Tubman, although was a slave owner, there were no Tubman slaves. There was no Harriet that was a slave for enslaved person for Theodore Tubman. So my theory is that that's how it began, or that's at least one of the ways that it began. So it's probably a combination of all of those possibilities. But anyway, we want to make sure we kind of dissuade people from believing that that was the case. So in addition to charging people with actually assisting and enticing, there was also this incitement to flee. And there were several publications. Keep in mind, there was a large abolitionist network national, primarily in the North, places like Pennsylvania. Philadelphia was a big area for abolitionist movement, New York, Boston. And they would distribute publications. The most famous, of course, is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. But there were other publications. And states like Maryland actually outlawed that form of speech and threatened to punish those who even owned a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. In fact, Samuel Green was sentenced 10 years in Maryland Penitentiary for owning a copy. So Maryland tried very hard to dissuade people from even talking about escape. This is probably the more popular book among abolitionists in terms of freedom seekers, and this is called The Concise View of Slavery, and it was published in 1834 in Philadelphia. This particular book was the text that was allegedly distributed by Susan Pumphrey and William Williams. They were both free blacks living in the Ellicott Mills area of Howard County in 1840. They were charged with circulating or assisting to circulate certain pictorial representations and a pointed book or written paper to create discontent and stir up insurrection. A third person, local business owner John Day, who some of you may know is kind of a famous Howard County business person, and there's signs for him, and his grave is up there behind the parking lot of UC Pops. He was charged. He was on the original indictment, was never charged with that crime. So supposedly, according to the court documents, they had met at the Disney Hotel, which of course is this building right now right there on Main Street. And this is where they reportedly met when they were planning to distribute copies of The Concise View of Slavery. Deborah Disney, if you're not familiar with, is a female property owner who owned the hotel and all the land behind it that eventually became part of the courthouse. Interestingly, this hotel was also the site of the slave auction at around that same time. And here's how it might have looked in the 1860s. It's wild to think about that, and there it is, still there today. The homes that these people lived in are still buildings in Ellicott City. Yeah. All right, we'll turn it over to Jerry, who did the research on Wesley Green.
So Wesley Green is one of the individuals who I previously referred to as a conductor from Howell County. He was born into slavery around 1811 and is described in various records as a mulatto who was a farmer and a laborer. He was manumitted by Charlotte Spurrier, freed by Charlotte Spurrier. And the manumission date, according to the record, is August 12th of 1841. But there's actually a certificate of freedom for him. It's August 10, 1841. So 2 days earlier. I don't know why he would get a certificate of freedom before he had been manumitted. But in any event, Charlotte Spurrier, she had property called Spurrier's Lot that was very near where Bright Dam is now. So a couple of days after he was emancipated, Green helped 9 men escape from slavery from the Cooksville area. There are reward notices that were placed for, I think, 5 of the men that indicate that they had escaped on August the 15th. So that's just days after he was emancipated. And he evidently took the men to Hanover in York County in Pennsylvania because he one of the witnesses in the later case that testified against him was from the Hanover area. And there's actually another witness who authorities from Howard County interviewed in the Hanover area as well. So it's also likely that he had been paid by the men to lead the escape party. One of the men who was going with him to Pennsylvania had gotten some $256 from his master, and he had taken it. And so the men had a good amount of money when they left. In the initial papers, the Historical Society has these papers. The initial papers indicate that he had fallen under suspicion of being involved in this escape by September 23rd, so a little over a month after the escape. But he was being held in, West Green was being held in the Howard County Jail at that time because they didn't think they had enough evidence to bring charges against him. But the authorities from Howard County wanted to, and ultimately did, go to Pennsylvania to speak to witnesses there. And subsequently, he was charged with 9 counts of various things involved with the escape of these men. His case was transferred to Anne Arundel County, and he was ultimately convicted of 3 counts, and they kind of let the other ones drop because he ended up, at that time, the penalty for assisting a slave in escaping was 4 years, so he got 3 4-year terms, a total of 12 years. And one thing to the $600 reward that was later increased to $1,200 was offered for the capture of the 5 men, which shows the significant amount of money that was offered in these rewards. So ultimately, Wesley Green is incarcerated in the state penitentiary, and he ended up dying there a few years after he arrived from tuberculosis. So his time as a free man was very, very brief. He was free maybe August 10, August 12, and by September 23rd, he was in jail. And I think that Wesley Green should be considered the conductor because it's evident that he accompanied the men he was helping to Pennsylvania. And one unknown is whether he knew any Underground Railroad agents in Hanover. We don't know if he did or not, but if he did, he probably should be considered to have been an agent of the Underground Railroad because he was working in concert with them in Pennsylvania.
All right, Dan, I'll talk about Warner. Warner Cook. Okay, well, Warner Cook was a slave in the western part of Howard County. He was asleep. He was freed by his master, and became a preacher. He married, had a family, and he was, I guess, what we call a traveling type preacher. He would cover most of the western part of the county. Various census reports show him living in Frederick, living in Sandy Springs, which is just across the line into Montgomery County. And he was accused of encouraging, and I guess there was like the Hobbs slaves, and I forget the other one, out of the Cooksville area to run away. He was charged with that, and
during this time period, he was ordained a deacon in the Methodist Episcopal Church in Baltimore at one of the big hearings there, and eventually became a minister. At that point in time, he was living in Sandy Springs in a small black community, and when his trial came up, the local Quaker person there basically, and then I'd say I'd say about 10 or 12 people showed up as character witnesses for him, and he was actually acquitted of that particular entity. And he continued doing his preaching from then until he eventually, passed away in the late 1800s. Jerry.
John.
The case of John Ingalls, he was, we don't know a lot about John Ingalls. We had a couple of newspaper articles involving his case, but they indicate that he arrived in the Lisbon area sometime around 1848. He was probably in his late 50s then. He appears to have been a working class white man, and that's based on some of the descriptions of him in the newspaper articles, and also there's no record of him ever owning any land in Howard County, and he also doesn't appear on the Howard County tax records. But by May of 1850, he was offering to help enslaved people in the Lisbon area to escape. And he had spoken to 3 enslaved men in the Lisbon area and told them that he would take them to Pennsylvania in exchange for corn that they took from their master's supplies. So on the evening of May 15th of 1850, Ingalls met with one of the enslaved men in a barn, and he was supposed to pick up a dog. When they arrived, it was the moon was high and it was pretty bright out. So he didn't want to leave until the moon had gone down some, because he didn't want to be seen. So he stayed in the barn, and he was talking to this enslaved man about, the whole process. And he told him how he get her to Pennsylvania, and there were different routes to take, and wages were very good in Pennsylvania, and there was plenty of work, and made it sound great. And he said he'd take the 3 men to Pennsylvania for $50, presumably corn, because that's what he was there to get the first installment. And he would come back a week later and get the second installment and have a bigger wage. So he would get no corn the next week. And he made the statement that he's apparently had done this before, because he says, "I never was caught, and I should never be caught, and never shall be caught." And right after he says that, the owner of the slave he was talking to jumps out and with 2 other guys, and they grab him and take him into custody, where he's charged with enticing, encouraging the slaves to escape. He had been the enslaved man he had talked to. They spoke to his master about what was going on, and he went out, So because Warfield, who was the George W. Warfield, he went and had 2 other men in the barn with him, and he was put in the Howard County Jail, and the Howard County Jail was in a very deplorable condition at the time, and there were fairly frequent escapes from it. He happened to escape from the jail, I think it was in late June, and appears to have never been caught. So we don't know what happened to him. And a couple of points I want to make about his case was he was asking for $50 to help transport these men to Pennsylvania. And one thing I've seen in the research I've done is it was very, very common. It seems like just all the cases that there was money that was paid to the conductors in the South to provide the assistance to get the enslaved man to Pennsylvania. There's one of the men who was one of the leaders of the Washington, D.C. Underground Railroad. He was there between 1842 and 1843 when he became suspected of being involved in the Underground Railroad and had to leave and now ultimately went to Canada. But he wrote his book. His name is Thomas Smallwood. He wrote a book in 1852 about his involvement in the D.C. Underground Railroad and talk about how the first stop, he said that the first stop that they made was 37 miles from Washington, which the author of a book that came out a couple of years ago, book of New North by an Baltimore Sun writer named Scott Sheen. It was a book that detailed Smallwood and Smallwood's activities. He suspected they were going to Baltimore, but Smallwood mentioned in this book that he wrote in 1852 that to get a teamster to actually drive a wagon to wherever, which Scott Sheen thinks it Balmy, for the first leg of the escape, they had to pay a lot of money to the teamsters because there was a lot of danger involved. And he said some of the amounts, and they're kind of as like $50 or something like that, or something in line with what Ingalls was looking for in this case. And it was like in other cases, it's very, very common to see that people in the South or conductors who were in the South were looking to get paid for providing their services. And another thing that comes out in the Ingalls case that comes out in other cases as well is you could trust no one with this, or trust very, very few people. Because here Ingalls is reaching out to the enslaved man, offering to help them escape, and one of them reporting to his master. Well, that enslaved man who reported Ingalls, he might have been afraid that Ingalls he may have not trusted Ingalls and may have been afraid that Ingalls was going to try to do something with him. Because there were cases, and then there's one in Baltimore where some conductor would dope some enslaved people into escaping, maybe get some money from them, and then go take them and hold captive until the reward notice came around, and then try to get the reward money. So it was very, you had to be very careful on who you were trusting. And, maybe this enslaved man in this case thought Ingalls was going to try to do something like that to him.
Right.
Yeah, as we talked about earlier, this was very much clandestine, and as Jerry said, you couldn't trust anyone, which is why it's so difficult to do this kind of research. This is a case of Alexander Bond. The Bonds were a family of free blacks who lived on a farm next to the property of Eliza O'Neill. And according to Howard County Circuit Court records on June 1st, 1862, Alex Bond unlawfully did entice, persuade, and assist a certain Negro named Amanda Green, the slave of Miss Eliza Ellen O'Neill, to run away from her lawful owner. So Bond was arrested. In trial, Amanda Green was forced to provide testimony against Alexander Bond. Bond was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 39 lashes. So, fortunately, this story has a happy ending. So census data from 1870 and 1880 appear to confirm that Bond later married Amanda Green and moved to Washington, D.C., where they raised a family. Now age 29, Alexander Bond is listed here as a laborer in the records in the birth of their son. Both are listed as born in Howard County, and Amanda is referred to as Mandy Green Bond. So sometimes these efforts were for love.
Now, Bond was white or black?
He was a black man.
Yeah, and where was that in Howard County?
I have to go back. I was just trying to remember where actually the farm was located. I think it was to the west of Clarksville. Oh, yeah. So this is another story that actually is documented in the WPA records. This is the story of old Joe Nick. How many of you guys have heard about old Joe Nick? Okay, if you're like Howard County history person, you probably heard about this guy. So this story was recounted by a gentleman named Tom Randall. This is in 1936 as a part of the WA project to interview former enslaved people. And they're fascinating stories, and they are recorded on tape, and you can actually hear those stories on National Archives. So here's how he recounts it. This is Tom Randall. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, Joe ran away. Everybody saying to join the Union Army. Joe Nick drove a pair of horses hitched to a covered wagon in Ellicott City. The horses were found, but no Nick. Rogers offered a reward of $100 for the return of me. Randall continues, his offer drew to Ellicott City a number of people who had bloodhounds that were trained to hunt Negroes. Each owner prided his own pack of being the best pack in town. They all stopped at the Howard house, naturally drinking and treating their friends and each other. Old Joe left Ellicott City on a freight train going west. Later, who says, in June of 1865, Old Nick returned to Ellicott City dressed in a uniform of blue, showing that he had joined the Federal Army. There's the historic Howard Hotel today. And again, these places are still here. You can still see them. Here's how it looked in the 1860s. So this is a particularly well-known story for the older people of Howard County. I'm sorry, guys. You raise your hand there. But there are inconsistencies in this story. For one, Reuben Rogers, who's listed as the owner, would have only been 12 years old in 1863. Also, there are no Rogers listed as enslavers in 1861 and no runaway acts for anyone named, posted by anyone named Rogers in 1863. If Joe had been arrested on his return, as Randall claimed, there would be court records and details about the indictment, which there are not. So this is why it's important to corroborate your stories, especially oral history, with facts. And this is what guided us throughout the process. This is why we focused on the court cases as opposed to stories, because those were documented. Those are, we have written records of those cases. In this particular instance, so Tom Randall would have been 7 or 8 years old when this story happened at the time, and he was 80 years old when he told the story. So I think possibly Randall maybe wove a few stories together into one, perhaps. But again, there's no documentary evidence to prove any of this was the case. It's an interesting story, and maybe parts of it are true, maybe related to some other people, but certainly old Joe Nick. We actually look for a Joe Nick living with any Randalls. Dan and I spent a long time doing this research because here it is documented, and you'll see this on public websites, this story. But we could find no evidence that this was true. So again, this is why the research process is complicated, and you have to make sure you cross your I's and dot your I's and cross your T's when you're doing this. All right, I'm going to give it back over to Dan. He and Alexandra did the research in the Anderson family, which is a fascinating story as well.
Yeah, this is an interesting story. Joseph Anderson was born free, black, in 1815. We pick up the story in 1850, where he was living on a farm north of Frederick Road, probably above West Friendship area, or slightly east of that, but up in that area. he ran into some difficulties in terms of finances, and he they had a court case where basically he had to transfer all of his belongings to Richard Brown. Richard Brown happened to be the oldest son of the owner of the farm, who was Susanna Brown at the time, and they all show up on the 1850 census as Joseph living on the property with Susanna and Richard. Susanna was a slave puller. One of her slaves was Joseph's wife, Caroline. In 1853, Susanna freed Caroline with a certificate of freedom, and they moved still within the same area in North Frederick Road area, and they show up in the 1860 census with 4 children. The next year, which they went ahead and indentured their oldest son, Joseph. This was a practice that was not uncommon in that time period for families with financial issues where they couldn't support the children or actually themselves. So they basically indentured their son Joseph to a local blacksmith for $100, which was a significant amount, for 13 years. The indenture idea was to maybe act as an apprentice to gain a trade, and at the same time provide shelter, food, clothing for the child. Later that same year, Joseph was charged with enticing George Ellicott, third generation George Ellicott, servant woman who was his slave, Sophia Jones, to run away. Now, the interesting thing about this, right about that same time, we checked the Quaker records. And at about that same time, the Quakers disowned George Ellicott from the Friends organization because of the slavery issue. A couple of months later, Joseph and Caroline were charged with enticing 2 indentured apprentices, again from George Ellicott, to run away. They happened to be 2 of their children, John and Susanna, which means they probably indenture them sometime earlier, but for whatever reason we don't know, they encouraged them to run away. We had a hard time finding the family, but we think we found them living in Baltimore County at the next census area. That's basically it. So what you have is a family that was burdened financially, and they actually indentured 3 of their children to help their finances. Joseph was listed as a laborer in some of the censuses, so I'm not sure what his skill level was. And that's it for there.
Yeah. What was the date on that? What?
Pardon?
Well, their indenture was that was before the Civil War, right? This is all going on before.
This was before the Civil War.
Okay, so basically all the stories we've talked about today are on the exhibit that you see behind you. I have these slides up here for people who aren't in this room typically, so you guys can just turn around and look at it. But so I wanted to talk a little bit about Howard County and the network to freedom. So this is the National Park Service, and they've recognized places that have some history with freedom seekers, Underground Railroad, and there are 5 recognized sites in Howard County. These are the original Howard County Courthouse that's now was washed away, I believe, in the 2018 flood. Is that right? But there's a sign in the parking lot down there behind the log cabin that describes that. The courthouse building today, right next to us, here to the left, the Elbridge Furnace Inn the Emory Street jail building, the infamous jail that everyone escaped from, apparently, that he kept finding, they would be in there for one night and so-and-so escaped. Who was watching these people? Um, the Emory Street building and the Howard County Historical Society. So a lot of people were like, well, why are you guys part of the network for free? Here are some sites. This is of course, where you guys are today, the former Presbyterian Church. That's the Howard County Museum of Howard County History. There's the jail on the upper right and the Elk Ridge Furnace Inn on the lower right. And there's some really good signage. There's the Oak Ridge Furnace Inn, by the way, describing the network of freedom. And by the way, these applications are very long. They're like dissertations. You really have to have a lot of evidence to prove that your site was a part of this network. And I've seen the one that Sean and Paulette Lutz put together many years ago for the Howard County Historical Society. It's extensive. So why us? Well, we have all the original documents. So we have the original many of the original manumission documents, certificates of freedom. We have, of course, research on the runaway ads. We have account books detailing enslavers' business practices and the enslaved people who lived on their properties. And of course, the prosecution of persons who aided and abetted the escape of enslaved people, the cases we've been talking about today, all of those records are in our archives. So that is why we're a part of that network. So just as a kind of a follow-up, we talk a little bit about the U.S. colored troops. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln made a proclamation that black men can serve in the U.S. Army, initially just in support roles and eventually as soldiers. And part of this was because they were losing a lot of men. The Union was losing a lot of men. They realized they had this fairly large population of enslaved men in the border states, primarily. And of course, free blacks who were living in other parts of the country. So they started this financial incentive program. So border states like Maryland were encouraged to offer enlistment bounties. So Maryland offered $100, and the enlistment bounties are not for the U.S. colored troops. They're for the enslavers. So if they freed a man to serve in the U.S. colored troops, they got $100. Federal government offered an additional $300. So there was a lot of money. That's a significant sum. And of course, in Maryland, by 1863, 1864, it was clear that the South was losing the war. Maryland was, in all likelihood, going to abolish slavery before the end of the war. And so these enslavers figured, well, you know what, I should probably just cut my losses and take this. So to the best of our knowledge, this compensation was the only, and I use the quote, reparations in quotes, for enslavement in the state of Maryland. I don't know if you saw this, but actually Wesley Moore just vetoed a bill about reparations for the state of Maryland for former enslaved people. This is an example. So this is 1867. In 1867, the former enslavers across the state of Maryland put together what we locally call the slave ledgers. They're lists of all enslaved people that they had. This was an attempt by the former enslavers to get money, to be compensated for their loss of income, their loss of property, their loss of people. And the General Assembly denied their requests ultimately. And in 1864, by the way, Maryland abolished slavery with the new Constitution. So a year before the end of the war, Maryland did, in fact, abolish slavery. So General Assembly denied the request. But this is Albert Warfield. And this is right from the, this is right from the slave ledgers. This is Albert Warfield of Howard County, and you can see this list of slaves. This is Samuel Hall, and you see that $100. That's served in the U.S. colored troops. So that's actually documented in those slave ledgers, and you can kind of see that. By the way, we have copies of them of this fascinating documents that we have at the Howard County Historical Society archives and Historical Research Center. So I think that's our last slide. So this. Okay. Uh, so hopefully you guys learned some new information today, a little bit about um, the uh, the stories from the past about what's happened here in the county with our former enslaved people attempting to escape, our freedom seekers, and those who assisted them. Thanks so much. Okay, well, we're happy to take questions.
I have got two more questions. In your research, you come across a historical proof how he slaves are combination, huh? So the second short is how far south at DC did the Underground Railroads actually are?
Well, I can answer the first question. The number of enslaved people that Harriet Tubman freed has been there've been a number of different numbers there. The number that you see at the Harriet Tubman Center in Dorchester County actually is the correct one, and I don't recall what that number is, but it's not 160 or 250, and you see these crazy numbers. It was a much lower number. It's probably I think it was around 70. If I'm not mistaken. Does anybody remember that? Okay. And then your second question about, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry, who's done more research on the Underground Railroad in DC and so forth.
DC was further south that the Underground Railroad operated, and they had some indication they started, I think, in 1842, and they were led by a guy named Story at first, and this person, Thomas Smallwell, who I mentioned before, is his assistant, and they kind of ran it 1842 to 43, and then they were wanted for different things and left. Torrey came back and ended up going to prison in Maryland and dying in, I want to say 1848 in the Maryland Penitentiary. And then I don't think anybody knows how long the gaps were between when the different leaders of the DC Underground Railroad, how long they had lasted. But the next leader was a man named William Chaplin. And he has kind of an interesting case that we haven't talked about that has a Hella County connection. He was in 1850. He was arrested for transporting a wagon that had fugitives in it just across the DC line in Silver Spring, and he got charged. I think it was maybe about hundreds of feet within narrow. So he was charged with with the things that he was doing with these with the fugitives, and he ended up shows the difference in how serious a crime it was. He was case was initially going to be heard in Montgomery County, but he had it moved. He got moved to Howard District. It still would have been then, and he wrote a book about his situation in the early 1850s and talked about how horrible that Howard County jail was. I don't believe he actually ever was in the Howard County jail because his friends in the North came up with bail money for him to get him bailed out. And they ended up posting someone $20,000 in bail money for him, and he skipped bail rather than come back and face those charges. And so he was the next leader. So he was going in for 1850, and then the next closer, guy named Bigelow, who I'm not as familiar with. But the incident where Chaplin was arrested in Silver Spring in 1850, they had been following him for a couple of weeks, and they thought that he's driving a wagon up to Sandy Spring the first night, staying in Sandy Spring until the next night, and then going in one drive up to Pennsylvania the next flight of the trip. So that was one of the pieces of evidence that I alluded to earlier, that he suggests that there wasn't a station or stave house in Howard County because he didn't stop it, and they followed him for a while and for a couple of weeks. And so evidently there was a one in Sandy Spring. But that, of course, that would have only been George Avenue, Westminster Pike. So still could be one someplace else. We just don't know.
Yeah, and Chaplin, you'll see listed a lot of times as a Howard in the history of Howard County, kind of Underground Railroad network stuff. But he never actually was ever here. He did nothing here. The only thing was his case was moved here. So that was another kind of thing we lobbied because there was a sign right over here that had him listed. And it's like he never even came here. There are lots of other cases we could talk about, but maybe we should talk about that one. All right. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there a national lobby for the Underground Railroad stops? And is that being researched? Because it's just interesting that there's a lot of unsubstantiated research.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, part of the problems with this kind of research, it was clandestine. Most enslaved people were illiterate, so they couldn't really write down. You had to rely on their stories. Stories, as we've discovered, are not always accurate, oral history. So there is, if you go to the National Park Service, they do have detailed information about the various sites that they've identified. Some of those are safe houses, some are not. As far as we could tell, there were no safe houses here in Howard County that we're aware of. It's possible that Jerry talked about Elk Ridge, 6 miles south of Baltimore, would have been probably around there. But yeah, now I hear a lot of people they'll say, yeah, I hear that our basement was a safe house, or there was a safe house, and you hear a lot of those stories, but they're unsubstantiated, and it's really hard to validate them. Yeah.
So Howard County didn't have the people who put out real that had directions on them, or the people who were stating because they couldn't really read, but they need.
Not that I'm aware of. I know what you're talking about. Yeah, the quilts that kind of get hidden messages. Not that you guys know anything about that? I don't know that happened here. I mean, it's possible.
But it did happen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sure.
Most of the Underground Railroad stories are from the North, and there's very few that I'm aware of anyway from the South.
There's a really interesting book. It's by William Still, and he was an abolitionist in Philadelphia. He was a free black man. And what he did was he interviewed every enslaved person who made it to Philadelphia. And so there was a slide up earlier. Bill Cole and Hanson were two men who escaped enslavement and Savage and made it to Philadelphia. And so they made it there because their story is recounted in Still's book. But it's a really interesting book because he interviews these people and he gives as much detail as possible. And I found 5 Howard County associated escapes in Still's book, including Bill Cole and Hanson. But if you're interested in hearing the stories, that's a really interesting read. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I work on the bicentennial history in Woodlawn, Franklintown, and Headville. And there was a family, to your point, we can't substantiate this stuff. The family had a Cooper, one of their ancestors had been in Cooper, and he had transported slaves in barrels, but absolutely no way to document that ever. But I will say, just talking to the family, I was like, this doesn't seem like a family that would make this up at all. But I put it in musical, and it's actually based on something, but who knows?
Yeah, there's Baltimore County, Baltimore City likely did have safe houses, but again, we couldn't find anything here.
One thing I found was you find more on Baltimore County than you do in Baltimore City with the Underground Railroad. Like Baltimore City, they mentioned one guy, I might remember, Gibbs, I think it was, and 2 women who worked in the market there. And not a lot more But there was one lead that I pursued that I didn't think could be substantiated enough, and that involved an escape made by a man named James Beddington around, I think, 1897, and he was enslaved in Hagerstown and was escaping to Pennsylvania. Now it's like, 5 miles from Hagerstown, not very far from Hagerstown. And this shows some that I didn't speak about enough before, I think, is the people who were escaping usually didn't know much about geography. So they're not traveling at night. They're traveling in unfamiliar territory. And sometimes, they've gotten some directions ahead of time, but it may have, lost where they are in those directions or made a wrong turn along the line. Well, James Pennington was going from Hagerstown to Pennsylvania, and he got, I think, 2 miles east of the fairgrounds in Howard County before he learned that he was on the road to Bowl. And he was told by one of the toll takers, you're at that 18th mile marker on the national road. And so he said, well, what's the best way to get to Philadelphia? And the toll taker said, well, you go down real ways and you can go, there's a road that takes you to Gettysburg. So he goes up this road towards Gettysburg and he runs into says a young man hauling a cart of hay. And so this young man with the hay says to Pennington, are you free or slave? He says, no, I'm free. He says, you had your free papers then? He says, no, I don't have them. He says, then you don't want to be on this road. He said, they'll take you up in about 3 miles. You won't last 3 miles on this road. You should go such and such place, and there's a house where there's somebody who will help you. And that was sort of, I thought, a lead for a safe house. But I didn't know if it was in Howard County or where it was, because the next thing you know, Pennington's in Reisterstown. And there is I think, a fairly well-known story about a Underground Railroad station or somebody involved in providing safe house in the Randallstown area. I thought he might have been there or something. It sounded like it was near Howard County, but I can say it was in Howard. But anyway, so
Springs. So I just wanted to say that a National Park Service who operate the Cambridge Government Center estimate 70 passengers on the Underground Railroad in 13 trips.
Okay, so 70 is
70 and 13.
okay. Good.
very.
Yeah.
So I recognize that you call that 2 established routes through your American route. How many established routes that these conductors followed were in the Underground Railroad?
In Maryland or? Well, it depended on where you were. Well, sorry. On the Eastern Shore, it would have been a very different, approach. Yeah, I think Tubman, you could still follow that same road that you use north to Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. So Philadelphia was a big abolitionist stop. And in Delaware, there were a lot of Quakers that lived in Delaware at the time. And so that was also a place to kind of make your way through. But with regard to other escape routes in Maryland, those are the 3 I know about. Jerry, you have any?
No, there's probably more that we don't know about. And like John Engel's case, I can't remember if I mentioned this about. He had told when he was in the barn talking to the enslaved man he was planning on taking to Pennsylvania. They said he talked about different routes that you could take to Pennsylvania. And he's in Lisbon, so he's kind of close to that. I'd say the Westminster Pike, that route, but there could have been others. So
yeah, it's like 97 and 15. If you think about the main roads that go to Pennsylvania today, those probably would have been the routes.
Yeah, Oliver took, I think, the 97 route, probably.
Oliver Cromwell.
Yeah,
yeah,
because he ended up in Westminster, then in York.
Yeah,
then he went across to Philadelphia.
Yeah, Oliver Cromwell Gilbert, who we didn't talk about. Septa Gilbert was one of our speakers a couple of years ago. Her great grandfather. So his story is recounted, but it's a little shaky. We haven't actually seen the full records of his description. He had a manuscript that described his life story, including his escape. And he escaped from a farm in Clarksville.
Cooksville, West Friendship area.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a different story, but we actually found the place where he escaped. That's Stephanie came to us asking about, I'm really struggling here. I don't know where this place is, the Hobbs School. Can you help us find it? And actually Dan did a lot of research on that to find the Hobbs Schoolhouse, which we did find. And that's where he escaped. And it's still there today. It's now a private home. The home. Yeah. And the property where they escaped from, there was a revival meeting there, and that property, the 5 acres of land that's open, is still there. You can still see it, and that's exactly where it took place. So,
And he was Oliver Cromwell Gilbert before he left. He was in the party of 12, I think. Yeah. Who escaped. And they had advice from a man named Mr. Fisher, who said was a miller. And part of the advice was that you should go around Westminster, I believe, that he kind of skirted. And so it seemed like he went up Westminster Pike too, but just demonstrates the importance of having good advice before you go in order to make a successful escape.
yeah, but we didn't put that story in because it wasn't part of the records that we had, and it's a little difficult to corroborate information based on, an excerpt, which is all we've really seen from his manuscript, an excerpt. University of New Hampshire, I think, has that now.
Yeah.
But it's never been published.
Because, first of all,
First of all, thank you for doing his research. Someone building you because you're reading it and sharing it. Separate internet, and the level of duration that the key story then if my husband like followed an audio wrapped driving lab of area client size. Near where the museum was been exposed at the time, so we can get to see the museum, but we could drag around and just see the stories that really easy, but I to build ups or captive, but super segment. The third thing, it's all same up. Did you know about kind internet in Georgia? So there's a book called the monsters, the Hanson, the mother has a hazy face or something like how Abba actually getting the office prey. But she was a slave. She lived right on the border, right at the corner of Maryland and Delaware border. And she would hop up state line. She was being day cycling. Ship sitting right next to like very barely kasi my big cupcake. And it's about the name she's very evil. She's gonna ask her, yes. Ines Philadelphia, get sparse Philadelphia, even there was Brazil. She had African American voice. We kept to get on this boat, we'll have to go somewhere and then take back that wolf. So she is both bro.
Interesting. You ought to know that story.
It might tell you just sure. It certainly is for you is learning more about what happened in Maryland where that time I had very connected.
Yeah. And Julie Slapitsky, who has been our speaker a couple of different times, is an archaeologist doing research on Tubman's original property, Ben Tubman's original property down there in Dorchester County, uncovering all kinds of interesting artifacts and things.
So I took a class years ago when they were preparing to build the Harry Tubman Park, Safe Park down at Blackwood. And Kate Barson was involved. And the class is all cheap rate, all histories. And one thing that they stress when you do oral history, it's that person's reality. And facts may check out or they may not check out. It's the way that person viewed that incident or that place. So I always keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you're right. I mean, people believe these stories. That's a part of their heritage and they want to share it. But you still have to, as from a history perspective, if you're doing research, you want to make sure that's accurate.
Yeah, you might zap check this by no let the rubber company what is that for?
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming to me.